This is the 10th lecture in the series, and he will be speaking on the game science approach to education. Uh, it's nice to know that this series of talks on gaming and simulation has attracted attention all through, and we are always joined by many people from many countries. Um, some people are off and on, but still, uh, many of them uh, are to be seen in this meeting. Um, in this university, out of several meetings which we have, we see more international people in this meeting than in any other meeting, since most of the members are from different countries. Uh, the game science approach to education seems to be a very interesting subject for people like us who work only in science, not in game science. And in our times, in our school and college times, the game and science used to be separate things. When you do science, you don't do games. And when you do games, you don't do science. That was the approach. But now, with this new areas of education, the gaming and simulation has assumed a very important role. And I look forward to this lecture to know more about game science approach in academics. With these words, I welcome you all, the
Thank
guest
you.
speaker and other guests joining this talk. Over to you, Dr. Rupali.
Thank you, sir, for the warm welcome. I'm pleased to introduce today's speaker for the session, Dr. Jan Edgy Klabers. He is involved in the game science approach to social systems development, organization and management development, and action learning. He has held professor and research positions in the US, MIT, Case Western Reserve University, the Netherlands, and Norway. He has been ISAGA General Secretary from 1976 until 2004 and is honorary member of ISAGA and SAGSAGA. His publications cover game science, social systems theory, design science, and analytical science methodology. His book, The Magic Circle Principles of Gaming and Simulation, is an essential reading for gaming and simulation scholars and practitioners. It provides the general framework for game science, which he presents at the design and use of games and simulations to advance research, design, and development of social systems. Sir, we are honored to have you for the webinar, and I request you to kindly start the session. Over to you, sir.
Yes.
Sir, we can start the session.
Thank you.
Good morning, colleagues. Today I would like to share with you the game science approach to education. And I have presented to you, I will present to you the following content. I will start with mentioning and just wrapping up the key roles of education. Then I step over and address the views on knowledge, because when we talk about education, we also think about and talk about the transfer of knowledge. Once you have that frame of reference in mind, I will move over to include that knowledge into learning environments and games. And then finally, I will pay attention to the learning cycle, which actually also from the point of view of the book is the magic circle. Can you, is it all clear on the screen?
You haven't shared your screen, Jan.
Let me see.
So you don't see the slides?
Not right now. You can share one more time. I think it's stopped sharing. Yes, it's visible now.
Okay. En dan,
Sorry.
oh. Ja, en nu zie je ook de mensen. Moet je even teruggaan als je wil.
Yes. Okay, the content of my talk is about starting with the roles of education, then move over to views on knowledge, then step and pay attention to learning environments and games, and finally I will address the learning cycle in the context of the magic circle. So let me first start with what I consider the key roles of education. The most important role of education is to enhance and facilitate personal, individual, social, and economic development in continuously changing pluralistic, and mainly industrial societies. And education should foster service to society. In addition, looking at professional education, that should foster a problem-solving attitude tuned to the ongoing rapid advances in society, in science and technology, and their impact on professional and social life. Problem solving requires that learners are viewed as reflective social actors who grow familiar with the indeterminacies of life and work. So in game science, we don't consider persons, individuals, as subjects characterized with a bag of traits. We see them as reflective actors, and in that regard, they are not just recipients of information, but actually they are constructors of information and knowledge. So playing games is especially suited to enhance collaborative problem solving. When playing games, it's very important that we realized that it is a total experience involving the whole person, which includes the embodiment, the feelings included, cognition, focusing on conceptual knowledge, conation, the question what drives the person to act and strive, skills available to that person, and last but not least, the norms and values that are important for the persons and players involved. With these ideas in mind, I next shift to discuss with you, present to you views on knowledge. A major task of game science is making the learners aware of and knowledgeable about varying views on knowledge and knowing. The educational system faces two fundamentally different choices in viewing knowledge. One is the objectivist approach, and the other is the so-called constructivist approach. Looking at the objectivist approach, it relates or deals with the epistemology of an objective reality out there, independent of the observer and leading to a techno-scientific rationality. I think that's the overwhelming view of science on knowledge. But in addition, and especially important from the game science point of view, is a constructivist approach. It stresses that knowledge depends not only on its degree of fit with nature, which is actually the activist approach, but also on its correspondence with individual and social constructions of reality. These different views on knowledge lead to different ways of thinking and acting. The objectivist approach requires and assumes that we should focus on analytical thinking and focus on the degree of fit with nature, which is actually, let's say, the overwhelming view of the science as we know it at universities. The constructivist approach is more interested in design thinking and acting, including individual and social constructions of reality. This has important consequences, as I will show you later. When looking at the constructivist approach and referring to Brown, then we should realize that knowledge is situated, being in part a product of the activity, the context, and culture in which it is developed and used. It means, and the implication is, that the noun knowledge that we are all familiar with is and should be complemented with the verb knowing, which indicates action, which is a precondition when playing games. The role of learning shifts from the permanence of possessing encoded knowledge to the constant flux of being engaged in through learning by doing, knowing in action, reflection in action, and reflection on action, which relates to developing embodied and situated knowing. The related set of keywords is practice, discourse, and embodiment. To understand this picture, I invite you to assume that you are a facilitator of a professional game, let's say a business simulation or a general management game, and you were running such a game session with 25 people divided among 5 teams that cooperate together. And you use that setting of a game, you use it for example, for in-company training. In that case, as a facilitator, you should be aware of 4 types of knowledge that emerge through such a game session. The most obvious one is explicit knowing. It is encoded and it's generally, it is included in the manual of the game. And it's also very explicit in terms of the knowledge that is presented to the players. And if you play this in-company game for different groups, you can assume that the explicit knowing is quite similar over groups, but that is not the case with the other three types of knowing. Tacit knowing, of embodied or embodied knowing, is specifically related to the set of players that are involved. But that also applies to local knowing. In every group of players deals with local knowledge, and that might shift over the different game sessions. And in general, all the players are based in terms of the way they perceive and experience the experiences of the game is very much driven in the background by their unculturated knowing in terms of their basic attitudes, their mentality. So when I say that gaming is a designed and multi-layered experience, it means that the facilitator should be aware of the fact that he or she is dealing with 4 types of knowing that play a role eventually at the end of the game during debriefing, that these types of knowing should come to the surface. With these ideas in mind, I now shift to different learning environments and related different types of games. My main question is to you, which learning environment fits best with these different views on knowledge? I have distinguished 3 learning environments: the classroom, which is a setting we are all familiar with, the flight simulator, and free play. These different learning environments influence also the way we view the learner. In the classroom, we view the learner as a kind of mental container. And the classroom as such is a reproductive learning environment. The learners learn to reproduce existing knowledge. The flight simulator is more related, is more focused on heuristic learning environment, and the learner is viewed as a reflexive actor. In terms of free play, the learner is viewed as a reflexive and reflective actor, and the free play is considered a self-organizing learning environment. When you look at these 3 different types of learning environment, we should realize that also the locus of control is shifting. In the classroom, the locus of control is with the teacher. In the flight simulator, the locus of control is much more with the facilitator, who acts as a kind of referee. And with free play, we are dealing with an interesting situation that the locus of control shifts to the players, to the learners themselves, in cooperation with the facilitator. So it's very important to see this shift of locus of control and the different views on the learners. Let us take a look at the classroom as a reproductive learning environment. The typical setting of a classroom, as shown here, it's a rigid setting, and the focus of attention of the learners is on the teacher. In the typical classroom, teaching is based on behaviorist views on learning. It relates to positive and negative incentives and repetition and reinforcement, a kind of stimulus response learning. And successful students develop an increasingly accurate ability to reproduce existing knowledge, mainly about the material world. That world contains facts and principles. Education aims to transfer that reproductive knowledge into the mind of the learner through reinforcement. Knowledge acquisition in the classroom is very typical when we look at the role of the teacher. The teacher's role is to help the learner to construct and internalize the material and become owner of it. Knowledge acquisition is predominant in techno-scientific rationality approaches, which make a separation between knowledge and knowing. Knowledge is treated as an integral, self-sufficient substance, theoretically independent of the situations in which it is learned and used. So actually it is context independent, it is universal. Looking at the flight simulator with a heuristic learning environment, then these are different media of representation of the flight simulator. So a business simulator or business game is also conceptually a kind of a flight simulator. Even if it is a board game, the basic structure of the flight simulator is, as I will show you later on. But first I will address that the heuristic learning environment focuses on the conceptual and skills. So there is already an embodied part in playing a role in the flight simulator. It's important to be aware of the fact that embodiment, the enactment of knowledge and concepts through the activity of our bodies, is a powerful force for learning. Even if you see different media of representation of the flight simulator, the generic structure of the flight simulator is as follows. On top of it are actors that interact with each other, and in doing so, build a social organization. And through rules that play a role at the interface with the environment, in this case with the resources, through rules, the actors intervene in two different kinds of processes. In the material systems, which is connected to the information system, and together they form the resources that are available in these flight simulators as games. So keep in mind that these different media of representation that I showed you, these different kind of media of representation actually have the same generic structure. Now let's move over to free play, to free form gaming and the self-organizing learning environment. These are three examples of free play. On the left, you see chess as a way of free play. Children that actually design their own playgrounds with the tools available, and Sims, the digital game that's all, I guess, all is familiar with you. It enables to build your own living room, your own living space. So these are examples of free play. They trigger and invite the players to improvise and taking chances. Moore and Anderson presented guidelines for designing such learning environments that particularly apply to free play. The first one is the first guideline is as follows: learners should be given the opportunity to operate from various perspectives. The learner should not just be a recipient of information, but should at times be an agent, a referee, and potentially engaging in the reciprocity of actions. The activities should contain their own goals and sources of motivation, not just represent means to some end, such as is the case with grades. That is, that these learning environments are ineffective if they are viewed as the activities from the point of view of their own goals in themselves. Learners should be freed from a dependence on authority and allowed to reason for themselves. They are invited really to play. They are thus made productive in the learning process. And this guideline is quite interesting. The environment should be responsive to the learner's activity. Not only should they be given feedback, but they should also be helped to be reflective, evaluating their own progress. These 4 guidelines are very important to be aware of, but they also require a certain competency from the point of view of the players. And that's quite an interesting question, how to deal with that in the practice of education. Summarizing, the flight simulator and free-form games represent multimodal, feedback-rich, and dynamic learning environments, and have distinguished 2 types of games. The first one, type 1 games, are related to the flight simulator, and type 2 games are related to free play. So let me show you some of the characteristics of type 1 and type 2 games. Looking at type 1 games, we should be aware of that they are rigid rule games. And as rigid rule games, they are closed. They are modeling a closed system, and they should contain all information to address the problem. The frame of free-form game for flight simulators is fixed. All rules are presented at the beginning of the game, and the facilitator starts with asking the players, the participants, this is the problem. How will you solve it? This question presumes that the solution is known, and it especially is known to the facilitator. When we look at type 2 games as free play, then we should realize that free-form games are open. The game structure evolves over time, while the game structure with flight simulator type 1 games is fixed. The frame of the free-form game is under dispute, and the participants are allowed and even invited to experiment with different frames to address the issue. At the beginning, start rules are provided, and the facilitator and participants tune new roles to the evolving situation. So dependent on how the situation evolves, the participants have the freedom and also are, you might say, challenged to change the frame to address the issue, the way it evolves. And the facilitator, at the beginning of the game session, will tell the participants, this is the situation, and how will you deal with it? And that is an interesting question, because that already could also be broadened up with rephrasing the question and saying, if this is the question, how will you deal with it? So in that case, the participants first have to discuss with one another, is this the situation, or is this situation viewed from different points of view and might have different meaning for different types of players? With this frame of reference in mind, I will next move over to facilitating game-based learning and looking at the learning cycle, which is very much related and embedded in the magic cycle. I have distinguished two types of cycles in terms of a game session. The first one is the macro cycle, and the macro cycle looks as follows. It starts with the briefing, which means that the participants are invited to reading the player manuals. And while reading these player manuals, they are invited to assume their different roles. Once the briefing is over, then they start actually playing the game, which I call the microcycle. And I will discuss that later on. Once the game is over, I distinguish two kinds of debriefing. The first one is debriefing 1. And it's very important in terms of the different types of knowledge, the 4 types of knowledge and knowing that I addressed earlier. It's very important that debriefing 1 actually triggers questions by the facilitator in terms of not so much the explicit knowing, but much more triggering questions that deal with tacit knowing, with acculturated knowing, and with local knowing, depending on the specific groups of players. And it's also an invitation for each of the players to tell their stories or the way they experienced the game, what happened and why it happened, and who actually in a certain way and what kind of influence it had on the way and the decisions they made during gameplay. After the debriefing 1, the players have a general notion, you might say they have a gestalt of what the game is all about, or what are the main issues that have been dealt with, and how they have been dealt with, and what kind of assessment it means for them. It's very important then use debriefing 1 as input for debriefing 2. And debriefing 2, the basic question is, if we all have this kind of experience, what kinds of concepts, what are the key concepts that we're dealing with, and how are they related with one another? And how can we use that general understanding to see what we can do, how we can handle the issue at hand? In principle, after debriefing 2, it's possible to start all over again, and with the knowledge acquired and gained through the first macro cycle, it's possible to invite the players again and play the game all over again, and maybe with specific changes in the context of use. And as a facilitator, we should be aware of the fact that even, and especially that applies to the free-form games, that every time when the game is played all over again, that it might, that new ways of insight and new ways of experience might emerge. It's also possible to step out of the magic circle and use the knowledge and knowing gained to change existing situations for which the game is a model and to experiment with. But let me now move to the microcycle, which is quite interesting from the point of view of education and a point of view of learning. The microcycle on an aggregate level shows 4 different kinds of activities. When the players start playing the game, the focus is on actions and interactions, and it's a combined way of activity of all the players, and it triggers awareness of what is the game all about and what is the issue all about. That awareness is a trigger for the second step in the microcycle. Then the players in general are starting making sense of what's going on. What is the meaning of what is shown to players and how they will deal with it. So through sense making, they start with meaning construction on what the game is all about. And based on that sense making and meaning construction, they, on an aggregate level, move over to the formation and adjustments of cognitive maps, of schemas, of thinking and acting. And after and through this formation and adjustment of these schemas, they might start adjusting their action repertoire. They might start adjusting their common action repertoire that they are familiar with in terms of their work, in terms of their schooling. And then, using that new action repertoire, they move over again to maybe to shift their interaction, to change their interaction and take different actions. So on the aggregate level, this is the learning cycle of playing the games. My experience is that at the beginning, in terms of the learning style of players, some really might start with taking actions and interactions and move directly over to policy to formation and adjustment, not taking care of making sense as itself, because they're much more interested in formation and in adjusting their schemas. So it's this. It looks on an aggregate level as an quite linear type of learning cycle, but in practice, I've seen that in the teams that I start playing, that some start with taking actions, other players start already move over to making sense, and still others are adjusting their schemas on the basis of the information they got from the briefing. So it's not so transparent how the players will, when they step into the gameplay, how the players will use these different options, but on an aggregate level, as a facilitator, it's important to look at these different steps in gameplay and to use that information during the debriefing. And especially during debriefing 1, to see what actually happened and why did it happen. And because of what did that player or these players make changes. Summarizing this general information, this way of looking at game science in the context of education, it's important to be aware of that in the context of education, game science offers interactive learning environments involving the whole person and including embodiment, feelings included, and it's including cognition, conceptual knowledge, conation, the question, what drives a person to act and strive, the skills available to the players, and the norms and values. Game science views the learners as reflective social actors, which is very important, very different from the analytical point of view. And analytical science, they, especially when you look at the behavioral science and the social science, they look at people as subjects that are very well characterized through a bag of traits. Game science views the learners as persons that take action, and as persons also are reflective in the way what they are doing, and by reflection learn by doing and change their basic way of dealing with complicated issues as an individual, but also when collaborating with groups of people in a social setting. So it's important to, when I go back to this scheme, it's very important to summarize that gaming as a designed multi-layer experience, that the designer, but especially also the facilitator, looks at a game session as an experience in action, generating meaning and need for understanding. And that playing a game actually triggers knowing in action. It triggers reflection in action while playing the game, and it deals with reflection on action, especially during the 2 kinds of debriefing. And I would just, let's say as a statement, in every, especially in as every professional game, it's important that the facilitator is aware of 4 types of knowing that emerge while playing the game. In general, explicit knowing will not change very much over different game sessions by different groups. But the main differences come especially when you look at tacit knowing of different groups, different composition of groups, different ways of local knowing, and different ways of viewing at enculturated knowing, especially what is the basic mentality of the player, or what are the basic mentalities of the players when entering and playing the game. So these 4 types of knowing should be the focus of attention during debriefing 1. and debriefing 2. And debriefing 1 is especially focused on tacit knowing, local knowing, and culturated knowing, because they give meaning to the explicit knowing and puts explicit knowing into context. With this idea in mind, I hope that you have an idea on what kind of learning environment is most appropriate, and what kind of knowledge and knowing is most appropriate for different kind of learning environments. And I thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, sir, for the wonderful session. And you have illustrated so many types of games, and I hope that everyone like it. And I ask the panel members and the audience to please ask their questions if they have any. And you can write your questions in the question and answer tab also.
Jan,
Yes, yes, ma'am, please.
thank you. I love what you're saying. I always have. I'm wondering why in 2023 it is still so hard for educators to actually take up the concept of game science and or the concepts of using games for learning. Why are there barriers? What are they?
Well, let me I will go to back.
Sure.
Let me see. Well, thank you, Liz, for your questions. Quite interesting and also challenging. But what I consider the basic difficulty in taking up game science as a basis for education is that in academia, predominantly, it is the objectivist approach about knowledge. And it favors the theory of knowledge, the epistemology, of an objective reality out there, independent of the observer, leading to techno-scientific rationality. And we are all familiar with, let's say, the natural sciences are very much in favor of this approach, and for good reasons. But also the behaviorist approach in the behavioral science and psychology and sociology, for example, they also are very much in favor of this objectivist approach. They deal with so-called, what I call subjects, and subjects with certain traits, but they do not deal with persons as reflect actors. So the predominant way of using knowledge is objectivist approach and analytical thinking, focusing on the degree of fit with nature. And there in game science, we have two branches. One branch is the analytical science branch, which actually is in favor of this objectivist approach. But we also have in game science, the other branch is the design science. And the design science actually does not produce artifacts that are context independent. They will receive their meaning because of the context and the user. So there are two different realities in science, which need to be covered by game science. And it is in general very difficult for analytical scientists to move over and think about design as a way of constructing knowledge, which is context dependent. It's not universal. But there is a universal component in it, and that's based on the explicit knowledge that is built into the game. So in a game, you can have a mixture of analytical thinking and constructive design thinking. And it's mixing up people. I'm not sure whether this is sufficient answer.
No, that helps immensely. And I agree with you. I still want to find ways to help people get past the barriers you've described.
Yeah.
But it takes time.
Yes, we also have to deal with our own way of knowing, our own tacit knowing, our own local knowing, and our own unculturated knowing.
Yes, exactly.
And the culture of the analytical sciences is a different culture as compared to the design science.
Thank you. There is also a question in the Q&A you might like to look at.
One question in the question and answer box is, have you had any experience of the game influencing the players so much that they, without realizing it, are still in the game after the game has ended?
Could you rephrase that question?
Have you had any experience of the game influencing the players so much that they, without realizing it, are still in the game after the game has ended?
I can give you two answers to that interesting question. The first answer is, especially when referring to general management games that I facilitated, at the beginning of the game, I recollect that some players came to me and said, well, I don't like too much playing games. Could I just sit and look at it? I said, well, that's okay if you want to not to participate. But eventually they stepped in and started playing with the other players. And then they came to me and they said, I cannot experience differences between what I'm playing about and what I'm doing in my work. So it's very difficult to make that distinction for me. And that's one answer. The other answer is that what in a certain game, especially in this case, also a general management game, is that what the players learned, and especially learned during the debriefings, when they moved back to their workplace, they had difficulties in implementing what they learned because the workplace was not receptive to their new way of dealing with things. And I think we all might have this kind of experience, that what people have learned in a game and also would like to practice out of the game runs into trouble because the workplace is not responsive to these new ways of thinking. In that case, for that reason, it's very important that I ask you to pay attention to the following distinction. I make a distinction between design in the small and design in the large. And in design in the small, it's just designing and playing the game. But eventually, especially in professional situations, the outcome of the game need and should be used to change and develop the existing social system of organization to take on board the lessons learned. So there's a two-tier approach to gaming. And I focused in my presentation today on design in the small. But your question refers especially to the combination of design in the small and design in the large. And design in the large requires a different set of competencies to take on board the lessons learned from design in the small. Does this answer your question?
Okay, thank you, sir. So one more question in the question and answer tab by Mr. Akash Katia. And the question is, are the simulation and free play the only fields for games?
Could you rephrase that question?
Are the simulation and free play the only fields for games?
I am with Jan. Jan, I'm not sure I understand what the writer of the question is asking. There are many, many forms of games, and I'm sure Jan could talk about lots. It is, if the questioner could perhaps add a little explanation, it might help Jan with the answer.
I don't really understand the question.
No, me either.
Could that person rephrase that question?
It is Aksha Katya. If he or she could put the question a different way.
I think he is asking about what are the different fields for games.
Different?
Fields or applications for games.
Jan, can I help? You talk about open and, well, you talked about what I think of as open and closed games, and you called type 1 and type 2.
Yeah.
And he's asking, are they the only types of games?
Oh, when I talk about two types of games, I actually talk about the generic structure that's underlying many different kind of games. What I try to show you is, can I move back to the screen? Heb even hulp nodig gehad.
Klik naast dat scherm delen. Klik je daarop. Delen.
Okay. I will try to answer this question. You see, regarding the flight simulator, I presented to you, I showed you these examples of flight simulators. So I showed you different, what I call media of representation. These are all different, in terms of media of representation, different kinds of games. This is a board game, and this is a computer-supported game, and these are fully digital games. They can all be understood in terms of this generic structure of a flight simulator. So they cover a whole variety of flight simulators, but to understand their basic structure, it's important and worthwhile to look at these games with this frame of reference in mind. So when I refer to type 1 and type 2 games, these are actually generic structures that cover thousands of games that are available. But it is important to understand the wood for the trees, to understand that all these different kinds of games, the way they are presented, have a familiar underlying basic structure. Is this answer satisfying to you?
Yes, sir. I hope the question has been answered by you. And is there any other question from the panel members? You may please ask.
This is a question for me.
Is there any other question? I hope all the questions are over. And
to change and develop the existing social system of organization to take on board the lessons learned. So there's a two-tier approach to gaming. And I focused in my presentation today on design in the small. But your question refers especially to the combination of design in the small and design in the large. And design in
I was playing back the audio.
This is a question for me?
No. Rupali?
Rupali, to proceed further.
Yeah, you see, in terms of my presentation today, in terms of the game science approach to education, I focused on design in the small, because that is what most people are familiar with. But these games, in terms of professional practice, these games are actually used for training and development. And when used for training and development, it's important to be aware of the fact that design in the small should be an input to design in the large, because we aim to change the social systems involved. But that two-tier approach requires that we are aware of the fact that social system development is a very complicated process, and that game science can offer a frame of reference to deal with games, to experiment with different sorts of organizational structure, and to see which structure and which configuration fits best into the issue at hand. But that's something that is out of the question for my presentation of today. That should be, let's say, another occasion to focus on that quality.
okay, so thank you, sir, for the wonderful session. And now I would like to invite Dr. Jigyasu Dubey, coordinator of Center of Excellence in Simulation and Gaming, to propose the words of thanks.
At the outset, we express our sincere gratitude to Dr. Jan H.G. Klebers, founder and managing director, KMPC, the Netherlands, for accepting our invitation to conduct this session. In the session, Dr. Kleber explained the game science approach to education. According to him, playing game is a total experience involving the whole person, including embodiment, cognition, cognition, skills, norms, and values. Game sessions enhance experience in action, taping explicit, tactic, local, and incultured knowing. We are also thankful to the International Simulation and Gaming Association ISAGA for the collaboration and support in the organization of Pratiti 2023 Becoming Aware webinar series. We express our sincere gratitude to Dr. Upinder Dhar, Honorable Vice Chancellor, and Dr. Santosh Dhar, Rector and Dean of Shri Vaishnav Vidyapit Vishwavidyalaya Indore, for their continuous guidance and motivation. We are also thankful to Dr. K. N. Guru Prasad, Dean Sciences of SEEE, for being with us today. Our sincere thanks to the panelists, Dr. Elizabeth Lee, Dr. Paula, Dr. Vinod Damlekar, Dr. Alexander, Toshiko, Dr. Irina, Laura, and other panelists present, and all the participants who make this webinar successful. I am also thankful to Dr. Rupali Bharti and all the members of the Center of Excellence in Simulation and Gaming SEEE, as well as IT team of our university for their kind support. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Kind words. Now, I request all the participants to please fill the feedback form as mentioned in the chat box. And that's all for the today's webinar, and hope we will meet again in the next webinar in this series. And thank you, all of you, and have a nice day. Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank
ma'am.
you.
Good day. Good evening. Thank
Good
you.
evening.
Thank you, Clever.
Good night.
Thank you, Dr. Clever. Thank you, Dr. Lee.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank
Koshika.
you. Ah, missed.
Hier rechter linker.
In rood.